Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Be Found Online's webinar. Are you ready for the May Google Algo Challenge or change? Sorry. Maybe it will be a bit of a challenge. We'll learn today. It's presented by Be Found Online co-founder and CEO Steve Krull, who's joined today by our special guest, Dalton Finney, who's the technical SEO manager at Vivid Seats, the largest independent online ticket marketplace. I'm Brian Hall, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started, I have a short list of housekeeping items for us. The duration, the webinar today is scheduled to last a total of about 50 minutes. Recording. The webinar is being recorded. By tomorrow, you will receive an email that will include a link to an on-demand recording of today's webinar, so you can rewatch it at your leisure. Questions and answers. The webinar does include a Q&A session. Should you have a question, please submit it via the Zoom Q&A function. You'll see that down at the bottom of your screen. I will be monitoring those questions and will tee up several questions for Steve and Dalton towards the end of the webinar. Please know that during the course of the webinar, we expect to receive more questions than we can possibly answer. Rest assured that we are capturing your questions submitted via the Q&A function. We'll get to as many of them as we can, and we'll follow up with you if we can't get to your question in our time allocated. Our next webinar. So if you like the insight and advice these Be Found Online webinars strive to deliver, and if your company has a business-to-business focus, then definitely mark your calendars for noon Central on April 22nd. That's our next webinar, which will, like I said, will have a B2B bend to it. We'll preview the topic and share the registration link later in this webinar. Otherwise, sit back and enjoy today's webinar. And without further ado, here are Steve Krull and Dalton Finney. Hello, gentlemen.
Ryan, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for keeping us honest today by bracketing the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your lunch with us. I hope you're having something to eat. I don't think I'll have time during the presentation, but I do hope you get quite a bit out of this. Show of hands, who's afraid of the big bad Google algo update? Anybody out there? Anybody out there yet? I'm kidding. I can't really see your hands. I can't see your faces. I would love to see your faces, however. So we'll go ahead and we'll start jumping in here. Myself and my wonderful co-host, Dalton K. Finney. Say hello, Mr. Finney.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Oh man, I can't. I'm so excited to present this material with you. We're excited today, folks. So what you're seeing on the screen, this is a bit of an agenda, but these are the questions that we've been seeing. We've been seeing them in the marketplace. We've been getting them from customers. We've been asking these questions ourselves. So these are the questions today that we seek to answer. Now, this is by no means going to answer all of your questions. What I'd like you to do is make sure you're posting those, make sure you're writing them down. And as Brian said, we are going to follow up and we are going to answer all the questions. In fact, within a week, maybe 10 days following this webinar, you'll see all of the Q&A in a blog post on our website. If you want to make sure you get that, I'll give you a hint to be able to make sure we send that to you later in the presentation. So without further ado, we're going to dive in. I'm not going to bore you with an agenda slide. We're going to go and we're going to get right to it and start talking about the Google Page Experience Update. Google started talking about the Page Experience Update probably about a year ago, Dalton. Is that about right?
Yeah, they've been, in the firmest way, yeah, they have, but they've been hammering page speed as a potential ranking metric for probably 4, 5, 6 years.
Yeah.
I think last year they've really let the rubber hit the road on making it firm.
Yeah, so this is one of those updates from Google where they've given us a long lead time and they said, we're going to change the way we rank. And they've given us a lot of clues. They've given us a lot of information. The information is never going to be perfect coming from Google. And even if you read this description, I'm kind of left kind of like this. I kind of listen to if Google were telling me this, I'd tune out, my eyes would roll. So I decided that we would share with you a little bit more of a translated version. Really what I see this as is a combination of factors so that Google can understand how the user perceives the page. So what they're trying to do is take all of these performance indicators into account to say, is the website being nice to users? Dalton, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think is it being nice to users is a good simple way to look at it, but also is it a way to break that down? Is it easy to use? Is it quick to use? People's perception and expectation of web pages going faster is going up. So all of us users, especially on mobile devices, expect things to load faster. So Google is trying to sort of stay ahead of the curve and make sure that the search results that they're delivering are relevant and useful in the most in every possible way. But yeah.
Let me ask you a question here, Dalton, because I can't ask the audience right now, but what's your tolerance for a slow website? What are you going to do on mobile and on desktop? Do you have any tolerance for it?
No, I really don't. Even before I got really into the kind of hairy technical side of SEO, and I would always just click back. If it's gonna load slow, I'm gonna go find something else to do. I'm gonna go find the next best option.
only if I'm trapped.
And I become even more impatient now that I know how to fix it and what we need to do and the ramifications of it. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to talk about. We'll talk about fixing it. We'll talk about the ramifications today. But I want to start with why you should care. So why should we care as businesses, as business owners, as SEOs, as marketing managers, as directors of marketing, as digital marketing managers? Well, the reason is users. If I have a good user experience, if my site loads quickly, that leads to stronger engagement. That leads to stronger conversion rates, and stronger conversion rates lead to leads and or revenue. And if I think about the Google Page Experience Update with Google telling me to make sure that my site is compliant with all the things that happened before and compliant with all the new things they're rolling out, really that means to me that I have an opportunity to make a few extra bucks. Does that make sense for everybody? I think really what Google's trying to do here is they're trying to change the definition of good user experience. We've talked about it a lot, right? When we talk to our clients, our SEO clients, we talk about usability, we talk about conversion rate. Google's trying to force the game with regard to those things. They want sites to perform really, really well. And they also want sites not to bait and switch people too, Dalton. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later. All right, should I be worried? Well, Danny Sullivan, who is an industry veteran, he's been around almost as long as there's been an SEO industry. He used to run the biggest trade shows in the space. And now Danny has worked for Google for the last several years. And I tend to agree with this statement that they're not going to roll it all out at once. It's not going to be a 2x4 to the forehead in May when they roll this thing out, which is a way of saying, hey, we want to give you some time. We also want to see what the data tells us before we start moving sites too much around. What do you think here, Dalton, when you think about, should customers be worried? Should sites be worried?
Yeah, yes and no. Again, like the old SEO adage, it depends. We can never give a straight answer, but I do totally agree with Danny's sentiment. Google obviously has a number of rollouts, that have nothing to do with page speed in the past. And it's typically been more of a piecemeal response. And I do know that also since like COVID, a lot of things they've pushed back a lot of updates because they're allowing this sort of economic situation to percolate through and be a little bit more compassionate towards website owners that maybe they can't make all these necessary changes right now. But yeah, it's not just going to be like a light switch.
I don't see this as a light switch either. I see this as a combination of factors, and what they're going to do.
If the mouthpiece of Google is telling us this, then I think it's probably a good.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go in and talk about exactly what this update is, and we'll start getting into what it means. What we're going to do, we're not going to dive into the existing elements or factors here. I think everybody's somewhat familiar. I'll touch on those a little bit, and then we'll go deeper dive into the new elements, which make up what we call core web vitals. So mobile friendliness has been around for a while. They wanted your site to load fast on mobile and to be readable on mobile. I think I'm among the 99.99% of people that if they see a standard website in a mobile viewport, they run away. So we want a mobile experience on our mobile devices. Safe browsing. My favorite example of this is when I happen to be on airplanes and I'm trying to connect to the Wi-Fi. I get the browser message that I'm going to an unsafe destination. And for the life of me, I can never get there until I copy and paste that URL on Southwest. HTTPS is security. The internet's gotten a lot faster. So Google has made the move to say, we want every site to run SSL or HTTPS to make sure sites are more secure and that things are encrypted from end to end. This is going to encrypt your password even when it's not encrypted kind of thing. So we should all be running HTTPS. When this rolled out, Dalton, I believe Google's message then was mostly for transactional sites, but it's rolled much beyond that, hasn't it?
Yeah, it really has. SSL, the secure sockets part, has been pretty relevant again for at least the shopping cart portion of the internet since the very beginning, since e-commerce really took off. But you'll be hard pressed to find any website now that isn't running a secure site. It's usually just native on most CMSs and web server platforms. So I'd be shocked if anybody isn't using it at this point.
Yeah, the one problem we run into the most with websites, client sites, is that you'll see some elements that aren't secure. And that'll still flag Google to say, hey, by the way, your site's not entirely secure. The last one on this short list is intrusive interstitials. I call this annoying pop-ups. Google wants to see fewer annoying pop-ups on the way to your destination. They don't mind if you pop up after you get to your destination, but on the way to your destination, Google seems to don't like it a whole lot. So if there's something that I have in common with Google engineers, it's we both hate annoying pop-ups. So, all right, so there's our stack at the right side of here. What you can see is that the top 4 of these items, and thank you, Search Engine Land, for building most of this graphic. The idea is that Google's taking signals from those early 4 elements, and they're building new reporting with Core Web Vitals to bring this all together in one place so you can get an understanding of how the user is perceiving your website. So without further ado, we're going to dive into some of those new Core Web Vitals one at a time. I'm going to hand these slides directly to Dalton so that he can walk through those.
Right. So yeah, like Steve said, in the sort of new world of Google page speed testing, there are 3 big metrics that we're going to pay attention to. The first one that we're going to touch on right now is largest contentful paint. The next is first input delay, and the last one is cumulative layout shift.
I was going to give you a hint. Cumulative layout shift.
So real quick, the way that I'm going to talk about these next couple slides is we're going to go over what each of these metrics means from a definition point, what it means from a business perspective. Also, I'll give you a few tactical things you can take back to your engineers, assuming that some of you maybe aren't engineers yourself. The thing about technical SEO is page speed especially is probably one of the hairiest, most technical areas of technical SEO. So we could go down rabbit holes for hours on this, and we're not going to do that today, but I will give you some talking points and some tactics that, again, you can take back to your technical team. And one more sort of proviso I want to add before we dig into this is, as we go through each of the 3 metrics, you're going to hear that some of the tactics from one metric to the next to improve them are the same. There's not, even if you just improved one of these areas, you would likely see improvements across all 3 of these metrics. So there will be a bit of repetition there because they're not singular tactics. Okay. So the first one we're going to talk about is LCP, or largest contentful paint. So this is, a lot of these are sort of like made up words by Google, but what that means for us is, especially when you're on your mobile phone, you'll see while it's loading, you'll notice on the viewport, which is just the area of the page that you can see, the area of the device you can see, that there's what's basically the largest element in that viewport. So that could be a header hero image, that could be a big block of text, and that could be the outline border of the sort of frame of the website. It's usually going to be one of those 3 things, but it's like the main visual focus point. And what that means from a business perspective and from a user perspective is, while the page is loading, obviously there's code in the background that makes all the gears run, but visually it gives users a sense of completion, right? That something's happening, okay? That things are loading, that the visual portion of the website is there and it's happening quickly, okay? Even if there's technical things on the back end, that haven't quite loaded yet. From this perspective, is it a visually complete experience in the viewport we're looking at? So again, like perceived load completion, perceived is like the optimum word here, okay? And there's a couple ways we can.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no
Here,
problem.
click.
No problem. So there's a couple different tactics we can use. If you go in a couple slides, Steve will show you how to get your metrics for largest contentful paint, cumulative layout shift, and first input delay. But if you identify that largest contentful paint is a real problem area for you, here's a couple tactics that you can use to help address that. The first is pretty simple. You'll get a little benefit out of this. It's probably not gonna change the world, but you'll get a little bit out of this. Is you minify your CSS and JavaScript files. And what that means is if you've ever had the distinct pleasure of reading JavaScript, a lot of times there's white space in there, or CSS. There's a lot of white space blocks. What minifying does is it just kind of rips out most of the white space and it makes that file smaller. It doesn't change anything about the way it functions. It just makes it a smaller file to load.
And minifying is a word that only SEOs and developers could really love.
Yeah. Another one is, again, most of these recommendations are also going to center around JavaScript and CSS. Okay. So another one is removing, and this can be a real beast. This can be a real project, is remove unused CSS and JavaScript. So what we see, we've all probably, as marketers, we've all probably been through a site redesign, right? We changed the look and feel of how things operate. And when that happens, it's usually for the better. It looks more modern, it looks more hip. But what happens on the back end is not always the case, but sometimes your front end designers will just keep the old CSS and JavaScript in there, and then they'll just add the new stuff in there. So this file that has to be loaded by Google just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so if we can remove some of the old unused JavaScript and CSS out of these files that we're loading on our page, then that's less work for browsers to use, and it's, things are going to load quicker. Another one is, and this is kind of related, is minimize render blocking JavaScript and CSS. Here's what that means. Earlier, when we talked about what LCP, what is largest contentful paint, we talked about it being perceptive or perceived load completion. So if you have JavaScript that loads really early, that prevents things from visually loading. So if it's kind of like back-end code that runs the show and that loads first, but all the visual stuff loads later, that's going to negatively impact your LCP score. So you can maybe front load. One of the things you can talk to your developers about is maybe we front load our the visual portion of our website, because it tells the user that, hey, things are happening and you can see it, right? A couple other things is improve server response time. This is just, again, if you click something, if every time a request is made to your servers, how quick does it respond, right? It's like bandwidth. So that's something that your network engineers would have to handle. But we see that more often than not, that even major enterprise websites have slow responding servers. So that may be another quick win for you as well.
Cool.
Okay. The next one we're going to talk about is first input delay, or FID. Here's what that means. So if it's visually relatively complete and you see some object that you want to click, it could be that little hamburger menu, it could be a sign up for this BFO webinar link, it could be another link, it could be anything you would click on and it would do something, right? Play a video, download a file, click a link to another page. First input delay is, what's the gap? What's the gap in time between when you click something and when it actually happens? Okay. What this means is, sure, everything looks good, because what we're worried about on largest contentful paint is making things look good quickly, is a really sort of good way to think about it. But the next part is does it work, right? Does it actually work? How long does it take for the good looking thing to operate? So, right, I like to break it down here. So this is anytime you take an action, anytime you click something that should do anything, whether again it's downloading something, taking you to another page, playing a video, playing a podcast. How long does it take for your JavaScript to load to make that thing happen, right? So tactically, a couple things we can do, and again, like I said, there's going to be some overlap from metric to metric on these tactics. A couple other things that we can do on this also: remove unused JavaScript and CSS. Why that's important is if you have a file with a lot of unused JavaScript and CSS, browsers still have to load it, but it doesn't do anything. We're not even using it anymore. So one, you can sort of trim the fat out of your existing files. And another one is, yeah, go ahead, Steve.
And Dalton, an example of that is extraneous tagging, right? Maybe you had old tags for marketing platforms on your website. Those litter the landscape in terms of JavaScript.
Yep, that's you read ahead a little bit on my notes. So since Steve called it, in addition to JavaScript that does something that makes your site work, a lot of third-party tags, whether that's Marketo, Google Analytics, any like third-party A/B testing, your email marketing platform, most of those tags are also written in JavaScript. Okay, and so those are on every page that one of those third-party tags is on. That piece of JavaScript has to load. Now, those, if you need those tags there, by all means, put them in there. But a lot of times we get rid of platforms. We stop using a certain CRM platform. We stop using a different platform, email marketing platform. We start using a different one. Clean up your tags every once in a while. Make sure that everything's in there that's supposed to be in there and nothing else. Because if you're firing old tags that aren't in, that you're not even using the system anymore, you're just wasting time. Okay. The other thing,
and let me just add to that, if you're wasting time, the user is perceiving that wasted time. And if we talk about time as money in terms of user experience, then you're also wasting money.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Steve will get to that in a little bit, but a lot of this does come down to, we're all here to make some cash, right? Slower load time, and Steve will back this up with some good data, but slower load time also means less money. But one thing you can do to also optimize third-party tagging, in addition to pulling out ones you're not using anymore, which is just a waste of space, is also taking a good hard look at the ones that you do need. When do they need to fire? So for example, Google Analytics does need to fire very early. You should load it in the head section, but there may be some of them that you don't need to load. And I would talk to your marketing specialists about this, but some of these don't need to load until much later in the code. And so you can sort of defer those and push those down. Okay. And then if that's the case, other more important tasks can run quickly.
And then those will come after the largest contentful paint and the first input delay, so that the user experience is strong, even if you haven't finished loading all those tags in that code.
That's correct. That's correct. And a couple other really great tactics for improving first input delay is when, and it's going to sound like I'm coming down hard on developers and UX people. I'm really not. But a lot of times designers will use one big JavaScript file that has a bunch of discrete functions in there. So it does like 20 unique things, let's say. And so it's a big file, right? And they just load that huge file all at once. It's easy. It's easiest for them that way. But what happens is, like we talked about with largest contentful paint and first input delay, we have to like prioritize things. So maybe we need to load the files that control things visually first. So let's break up our large JavaScript files into smaller pieces and prioritize them in order of like priority in terms of like visual loading. Okay. So we can break it up, and also just high level. If you have any JavaScript, doesn't matter if it's visual, doesn't matter if it's functional, have a conversation about what can we load now and what can we defer until later in the process. Because again, we want to focus on visual first, functionality. And then the next one, and you can move to the next page, Steve, is cumulative layout shift. This is stability. I got to give some credit to a lot of people. I think a lot of websites are doing pretty well on this. And again, I have no data to back this up, but cumulative layout shift has gotten pretty popular in the SEO community. I don't see this happening a lot, but because it's being talked about by Google, I'm sure it is enough of an issue. What you'll typically see is on your mobile page, you'll load something and you might see the image at the top, like the hero image at the top, and then you'll start to see other images load, right? Maybe a block of text, a couple ads, email sign up box of video. But then what will happen is as the page is loading, the elements will start to shift around on the viewport, right? So maybe the text image was up top, or the text is up top, and then it drastically moves to the bottom once the hero image shows up. What that does is when all the elements and all the unique elements on a page start to move around a lot, that gives the user a negative experience. It makes it seem like the page isn't stable, and it just comes off as a poor user experience.
Yeah, it's bait and switch, right? A lot of times people are clicking the wrong button. Some people think they're being deceived when they're clicking the wrong button. So Google wants us to clean that up. Sometimes it's just an honest mistake by the developer who hasn't really run through Q&A of the code, or it hasn't been tested by the team in terms of, hey, what's going on there? So it gets rolled out. And ultimately, again, it's one of those things where if that button moves to the wrong place, you're not making your users very happy.
Yep. Yeah, you'll see this a lot on these kind of the one area where you will see this a lot is if you go to some of these, like Quora will do it, like if it's a slow loading page, sometimes it'll load here, part will load here, and just like Steve said, you'll click here and then something will push it down, and then you end up clicking a button you didn't mean to, right? So a couple tactics you can use to improve cumulative layout shift and just make your users' make your users feel a little bit more sane and not crazy when they're using your website is, so like I said, there's a couple big areas that we have to stabilize. We could stabilize images, blocks of text, and then like side elements such as ads, right? Like third-party ads.
So you can declare spaces for these things on the page. So they're always going to be in the same place?
That's right. That's right. So if you've got a pretty good idea of the structure of what your page looks like on a mobile device, if you've got a hero image up top, set clear height and width dimensions for that image. Sometimes a lot of developers, and we saw this a lot with, we've all probably heard the word responsive design, right? Where it's just the design, whatever it is, it responds and reforms and reformats itself to whatever the form factor is, whether it's your iPad, whether it's your iPhone, whether it's a Samsung Galaxy, it sort of molds and fits whatever form factor it's in. One of the downsides of that is developers would often leave out height and width declarations for images. And so what happens is that ends up like shifting images around as the page loads. So first thing you can do is set image dimensions in your HTML. You can also do this with CSS, also with what's called an image aspect ratio. So if it's always supposed to be 16:9 or 4:3 ratio, you can declare that in a CSS file as well. And that will give it a sense of stability and space on your page. Another thing is, again, we talked about if you're doing ads or banners or something like that on your page, also set image dimensions for those. I do know if you're a publisher, sometimes you don't always, you're cycling through different ads from different people, from different advertisers. And sometimes the size of the image isn't always, say, 100 by 100 or 960 by 240 or whatever. It's not always consistent, but do your best to, much like the images, declare a discrete space of height and width for your ads. And again, also not just size, but position. If you can, statically reserve space for text, statically reserve space for images, ads, videos. So take a good long look at what the visual layout, like the wireframe of your website looks like. If you can adhere to your wireframe that your UX people give you, that will really take you far in dropping down your cumulative layout shift scores, and again, giving your page a sense of stability.
Awesome. So that's about it for the technical walkabout. We're going to go back up to the business level and think about the opportunities of this, and then give you some steps in terms of how you can take a look at this for yourself in terms of what you should do to try and pay attention to this as Google rolls it out. So we'll dive into the opportunity here. I do see an opportunity in this, and Dalton agrees. We're often scared of Google updates, but if we think about this as an opportunity, take my example here. I've got 2 fly fishing sites. I've been watching way too much Gold Rush recently, and I looked at fly fishing in the Yukon. Great. So we've got 2 sites here, Fishing Yukon and the new Fly Fisher. So competitors, right? Second and third spot, fair amount of traffic between them. So let's take a look at their scores. If we look at their scores, okay, Fly Fishing Yukon scores a B, pretty decent scores, performance scores. And this is GTmetrix. I will caveat this by saying there are multiple tools. We'll share a few coming up. There are multiple tools, and they give you a little bit different data. So don't marry yourself to a single tool. Be wary. You can marry yourself to Google's tool because that's the one that matters. We're not going to go into Core Web Vitals during this call, but we're going to look at PageSpeed if we have time and a few others. But there's a lot of wonderful third-party tools as well as the Core Web Vitals within your Google Search Console. So we've got a B and an F. So if you're Fly Fishing Yukon, you're thinking to yourself, yeah, I'm doing pretty well. But if you're Fly Fishing Yukon and you rest on your laurels and the new Fly Fisher decides to get on with Core Web Vitals, now there's a statement to be made here that says content is still going to win. Good content, robust content is still going to win. We don't know where Core Web Vitals and page experience is going to factor in. I don't know if it's going to be a top 10 factor, a top 20 factor, 30, 40, 50, whatever the case may be. The reality is that if we know we can improve our user experience, and by improving our user experience, we can increase conversion rates, why wouldn't we do it is what I posit. Why wouldn't we? So if I'm the new Fly Fisher and I can jump from an F to an A in this, do I have a chance? Yeah, especially if Fly Fishing Yukon is asleep at the wheel. So thinking about that, if I get to work, Fly Fishing Yukon might not be defending their turf because they think they're in a great spot, or they simply haven't heard about the page experience update, which if you're an SEO, you should have heard about the page experience update, I imagine. So what happens if I get to work? I switch places. Now, if I'm Fishing Yukon and I defend my turf a little bit and I move that B to an A, well, guess what? Core Web Vitals is not going to help the new Fly Fisher jump me. But again, I don't see any reason not to do it. If it's going to cost a ton of time and money, yes, you have to prioritize it. But Google's telling us that they're changing the game this way. They want to see this. You can get out ahead of your competition, despite the fact that Google's going to roll this out slowly, they say. If you leapfrog your competition now, anybody ever lost a second place ranking and moved it down to a 5th and tried to get it back? It's really hard to get that back up to number 2. If you get to number 2, it's easier to keep it than it is to get to number 2. So it's hard to switch places. So if you can jump somebody by taking advantage of the page experience update, by all means do it, because they're going to have a hard time unseating you when they finally get on the bus and make these changes. All right, I don't know, do we have time for a demo or to show? Maybe we can get to one of them. Dalton, which one would you like to see? I've got all 3 loaded, and you can take us for a tour of one. We'll do one because I know we have a couple of slides left, and I want to make sure we get to it.
Sure. Yeah, they're all really good, and I use them to do sanity checks on myself, but my default one is the PageSpeed Insights, is the Google one at the bottom.
All right, you see it?
Yep.
Tell us about this page, and Dalton, how you use it.
Sure thing. So the first thing I'll do is jostle back and forth and look at the mobile versus desktop score. I think a lot of neither of these are great. I'm a avid customer of Coursera, so I'm not going to be nice to them. I'm just being honest here. I'm not saying anything out of anything malicious. They get a lot of my money, but a couple things I'd look at here. A lot of stuff's in the red. So again, we talked earlier about the 3 really big metrics for this upcoming update are first input delay, which is in the upper right-hand corner here, cumulative layout shift below it, and largest contentful paint, LCP, down in the lower right-hand corner. First contentful paint, by the way, just to give a little background, is just the first time basically anything appears on the page. So that could be as simple as just like a little, like a frame for that's a placeholder for an image. It doesn't have to be anything substantial. It's just like the first time anything visuals on the page. So that's actually pretty telling in and of itself, even though that's not one of the metrics we discussed. If you look there, it took 2.5 seconds on a mobile device, or 2.6 seconds on a mobile device, for literally anything to show up. So we're looking at 2.5 seconds of just white space. I mean, can you imagine that frustration as a user? Coursera, I've paid, every time I go there, I end up spending a couple $100 on a class. It's like, that's not fun in and of itself. And then you're like, well, I got to wait around for 3 seconds for anything to happen, and well over 6 seconds for anything major to happen, right? So that is the first thing we got to look at. Is it's taking 2.5 seconds for literally anything to show up. And first input delay is not great either. Once things get going, it should be much lower. But the largest contentful paint is troubling. And what that tells me is there's a really, really big gap between when anything shows up, which is 2.6 seconds, and when something, significant shows up. That might be a piece of text, that might be a header image, that there's still another 2.6 seconds there to for anything substantial to happen, and you go, oh, something's happening. This page actually works.
Yep.
Right. So my gut instinct here is they're probably loading a lot of like back-end JavaScript that maybe makes it work functionally, but it doesn't make it appear visually, right? So my gut instinct here, without digging into the code, would be it's probably not loading visually very early, and they should think about just deferring some of the functional stuff in lieu of visuals.
So, thank you, Dalton. That's just one of the tools. If you want to look at the rest, grab those. There's a couple more resources. I'll jump into it. We can, I don't know if I have the resources slide left in here, but you can reach out to us and we'll send you any resources. What I want to finish with, though, are the 3 to 5 steps that you can use to take advantage of this. Sorry about my technical issues, folks. Quickly, my note slide. There we go. Back to full screen. If I think about this, there's 3 to 5 steps, and these are business steps. There's technical in here, but if you think about this, it's this idea that do a page experience audit, think about it, walk through some of these tools, find out what these tools are saying about your pages and your site. Score the elements. What's the risk? How bad is it? What's the difficulty of fixing it? Work with your dev team and find out what the difficulty of some of these fixes are. Think about those things. Say, how bad is it? I looked at a site the other day where just the performance was the worst possible thing. They didn't have a cumulative layout shift. It wasn't bad at all, but the largest contentful paint took forever. So users are leaving the site. So if you do an audit and you think about these things, you think about all the different factors, put them in order, think about that. And then figure risk against resource, right? When we're working on projects with clients, it's not always the most important thing gets fixed first, just because that might be the biggest resource requirement. So you have to sort of pick and choose between your resources and your priorities. And also you might get some bang for your buck out of smaller changes. And if you look across the stack of what's included in the page experience update, there are a lot of little things in this, and all the little tips that Dalton shared earlier. There's a lot of little things that add up to a big thing later on. So you can make some changes. And what our advice is there too, is to roll this out in sprints. Don't think about it as an all at once update, because you can roll it out in sprints and you can check your scores again. Google's getting, but some of those scores, as you saw on the page speed, is that it's a 30-day window. So you're not going to get great stuff. So you're going to have to use the tools. You jump between the tools and find out how things are going. So think about that. Roll it out in sprints. Figure out what you can change and when. That way you're going to slowly improve it over time. And if you look at what Danny Sullivan had to say, you can take your time on this. And if you're working on it and your competitors aren't, well, then you do have time. But figure out how to get to that point. Not everybody's going to score an A, but if you're an F and you get to a C, you're moving in the right direction. If you're moving to a B, you're moving in the right direction. So, and then evaluate these things, keep evaluating, look at your rankings and traffic over time, and keep making sense of that stuff. That's our advice. 4 steps that you would follow to make sense of these things, and make sure you've got your team aligned with, If you've got poor scores, make this a priority. Yes, there are other marketing initiatives. I'm sure there are other SEO initiatives, but if Google's making a significant change as page experience, I would argue that it's better to get involved early on to make those changes than to wait and see what Google does. And I look at it from, how can I take advantage of my competition? How can I drive incremental users? How can I drive traffic? And that traffic should lead me to revenue, especially if we're talking again about some of the usability of your website. If you've got poor usability scores, even in Google's eyes, you're leaving money on the table. And we don't like that, do we? All right. We're finishing up. We got time for Q&A. We left about 5 or 10 minutes for Q&A, so keep the questions coming in. This is just a little bit about Be Found Online to let you know Dalton and I aren't just crazy standing up here having the conversation with you, that some folks in the world like BFO, and we like BFO a lot. We're really glad that you came and spent some time with us today. We're really, really happy to answer some questions. My little bit of housekeeping, and I'll hand it over to Brian for Q&A. Our advice is that it's a really good time to catch up to the competition. Take stock of where you are and decide if you're playing offense or defense. If you'd like the list of resources, those 3 sites I listed, plus some other things we went through today, reach out to the handsome guy in the top right corner of your screen, Joshua Dominguez. He'd be happy to get it to you. If you'd like some advice, you can bother him as well. You can find me on LinkedIn, search that name on the internet, the one down here in the corner, and I'll be the first one to pop up. I'm sure it happens for Dalton K. Finney as well. If you don't have time to do this yourself, hire an expert. Brian, welcome back, sir.
Thank you, Dalton and Steve, for that presentation. Learned a lot. So we do have some questions teed up. So I'd actually like to see Jim Beckham had a question. And Jim, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and ask you to ask your question live to both Dalton and Steve. So Jim, are you there?
Okay.
Jim?
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. Hi guys, good to catch up with you. Yeah, my question was just, are there any tools you'd recommend that can be used to track improvements to the scores over time? I'm just trying to think of ways that we would demonstrate the benefits of the work to clients or to our bosses.
Sure. Yeah, one thing, depending on if you're using kind of like one of these SEO, enterprise SEO tools, you know, Spotify, Deep Crawl, Bright Edge, those kind of things. Many of them have page speed functionality in there that you can kind of benchmark over time. But if you don't have one of those tools, I would suggest, one thing I do is take my metrics and benchmark them over time. So keep track. Okay, at this point, and I usually do this like right before we start a sprint of work that starts impacting, you know, page speed. So if we're going to do a, you know, optimized JavaScript next week, I'll benchmark things today and benchmark those scores. And then as work is completed, then we can roll out and then tie that back to, you know, go back, rerun the page speed rankings. I also know that with some, I don't think you can actually do this with Google. I might be wrong, but I know that with GTmetrix and some of the other third-party tools, you can export the data. But again, I'm not sure if you can do that in Google, but I definitely do it with GTmetrix. You're getting much of the same data as well anyway. So you could export it there if you're doing it en masse. I believe that GTmetrix will let you do that for a bunch of pages all at once as well if you have a paid subscription.
Awesome, thanks, I'll check that out.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim. And kind of a follow-up question, Steve and Dalton, to that. What's the frequency by which you should be sort of measuring these key performance indicators?
Sure. Because the work that is needed to make these improvements happen typically involves an engineer, typically involves, you know, getting a UX developer involved, backend engineer, something like that. Usually takes a good amount of legwork. It's just as that work happens. So I would highly recommend, like, if you know when that work is going to be done by the engineer, because it's usually not just pushing a button, right? It's a little bit more significant legwork. But if you know roughly when that work is going to happen, benchmark it as soon as you can beforehand. And then once the work is done and you've sort of like re-indexed your site and you know that Google has recrawled things, remeasure it after the work is done.
Okay.
You can also tie that back, in addition to just scores. You can also see, are there any downwind impacts with, overall improvement in keyword rankings for the entire site or whatever pages we improved. That'll take a little bit more time as well, but the more immediate payoff will be, once the site or once the optimizations are done, do you see, you run your page, should one of these tools do things improve?
And a related question to that then, how do you know if you've kind of done enough or you need to keep doing more?
Yeah, there's Google has set some really good kind of ideal numbers. If you go back a couple of slides, we don't have to do that, but if you go back a couple of slides, you'll see in the Google tool that they sort of set parameters like, hey, this is good, this is average, this is like needs improvement. I would stick to that first, and then talk with your engineers or whoever is doing the actual heavy lifting and saying like, hey, what do you think it's going to take to get from a cumulative layout shift of 1 to 0.5, something like that. But a lot of it also comes down to just testing too.
Okay. And then Steve, you mentioned the hire an expert, if you don't have the time. What other kind of reasons are there that you might want to use to maybe look into an expert?
I think that one of the bigger reasons is that we do this all the time. We're doing it across multiple websites, multiple web properties. We know what to look for, we know what to fix, and we also know how to fix it. So we're going to be able to have some of those conversations with the developers and the marketing teams to help them move the needle in the right direction, because we've seen this so much, and even some of the more confusing stuff. So a lot of people who know BFO know that we come at SEO from a technical side, from a technical perspective. So we understand sort of the back end of the website, and then we bring the marketing as a layer on top of that. So we're going to understand exactly how those servers are operating and how that JavaScript works. So we're going to have a really good idea of which JavaScript you can reorder, what you can minify, what you can remove, and things like that. Also, image compression technologies and other things are going to help speed up your page. So all of the different things that Dalton spoke to are things that we do on a daily basis to try and improve web performance for clients.
Great. Okay, good. We're bumping up against our time, so I think that's it for now. Let's let's see. We did get one other question that came in, and Brooke, we'll follow up with you offline for that. Good question. But I think we're bumped up against time, and so Dalton and Steve, I'll leave it up to you for last words.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I hope you got something out of the presentation. We did a little bit of a deep dive, and we did a little bit of the business side. If you have follow-up questions, please feel free to get in touch. And I can't thank Dalton Finney enough for joining me today and lending his expertise.
Good to be here, Steve. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brian.
Bye, everybody.
Everybody.